Welcome back to True Stories, where we bring you incredible moments that remind us about the power of compassion and standing up for what's right. Before we dive into today's remarkable story, don't forget to comment where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global family of viewers. When a police officer approached a tall man in a park who was handing out food to the homeless, he had no idea he was about to have an encounter that would change not just his perspective, but the lives of countless others in the community. Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the most unexpected moments, and this story is a perfect example of how true character reveals itself in how we treat those in need. It was a crisp autumn morning in Chicago's Grant Park, where the early sun cast long shadows across the carefully maintained lawns and walking paths. The park was beginning to stir with its usual mix of joggers, commuters taking shortcuts to work, and the city's homeless population emerging from another difficult night. But this morning would be different from any other, thanks to the presence of a man whose impact on Chicago went far beyond his legendary status in sports. The leaves had just begun to turn, creating a canvas of gold and amber against the backdrop of the city's iconic skyline. The morning air carried the hint of approaching winter, making the warm food being distributed all the more precious to those who had spent the night in the park's hidden corners. Steam rose from cups of hot coffee and containers of fresh breakfast, creating halos in the early morning light. Among the small group of volunteers stood a tall figure in a simple black hoodie and jeans, his presence somehow both commanding and humble as he handed out breakfast containers to the gathering crowd of homeless individuals. Though he wasn't drawing attention to himself, there was something about his movements, his quiet confidence, that made him stand out even in casual clothing. The man was Michael Jordan, though he wasn't wearing any of his famous branded gear or making any show of his identity. He was simply there, along with a small team of volunteers, doing what he had been doing quietly for months, providing warm meals and a touch of dignity to those who needed it most. His hands, once famous for game-winning shots, now passed out breakfast sandwiches and coffee with the same precision and care he had shown on the basketball court. The morning routine had developed its own rhythm over the weeks. Jordan and his team would arrive just as the sun was rising, setting up their makeshift distribution point near one of the park's main paths. Word had spread among the homeless community about these morning meals, not because of who was providing them, but because of the consistency and respect with which they were given. The small crowd that gathered each morning was diverse: veterans with weather-beaten faces, young people who had fallen on hard times, elderly individuals who had slipped through society's cracks. Jordan knew many of them by name now, though he never mentioned his own fame, and many of the recipients, especially the younger ones, didn't recognize him as anything more than a kind man who cared enough to be there every morning. What made these morning gatherings special wasn't just the food, it was the dignity with which it was provided. There were no photos for publicity, no media coverage, no attempt to draw attention to the famous figure behind the initiative. Just quiet conversations, respectful interactions, and the kind of human connection that can make a difference in someone's day. The regulars had come to know the tall volunteer as Mike, and they appreciated that he looked them in the eye when he spoke to them, that he remembered their names and their stories, that he treated them with the same respect he would show to anyone else. Some of the older residents recognized him, of course, but they maintained the quiet dignity of these morning meetings, understanding that this wasn't about celebrity, it was about community. On this particular morning, Jordan had arrived earlier than usual, bringing extra supplies because the weather report had predicted the first truly cold day of the season. He moved with purpose, helping to set up the tables and organize the distribution system that would ensure everyone got their fair share. His hoodie was pulled up against the morning chill, but his warm smile was visible to each person who approached. The scene was peaceful, almost choreographed in its efficiency. Volunteers worked seamlessly together, distributing not just food but also warm gloves and socks, essential items as the temperature continued to drop. The line of people moved steadily, each person receiving not just sustenance but also a moment of genuine human connection. Some of the regulars had begun to help with the distribution, finding purpose in being part of the solution rather than just recipients of aid. Jordan had encouraged this, understanding that dignity often comes from the ability to give as well as receive. These morning gatherings had become more than just a food distribution. They had become a small community of mutual respect and support. The city was just beginning to wake up properly now, with more joggers appearing on the paths and the first waves of commuters hurrying through the park toward their offices. Most passed by without a second glance, their minds already on their workday ahead. But some slowed down, observing the scene with curiosity or concern, their reactions revealing their own preconceptions about the gathering of homeless individuals in their carefully maintained park. Jordan continued his work, unaffected by the passing glances. His focus remained on the task at hand, on ensuring that each person who approached received not just food but also a moment of genuine acknowledgement. His famous competitive spirit was channeled into making sure no one left hungry, that there was enough for everyone who needed it. The morning light had strengthened, illuminating the scene in greater detail. The steam from coffee cups created a kind of halo effect around the gathering, while the city's skyline provided a dramatic backdrop to this simple act of human kindness. The contrast between the gleaming buildings and the simple act of sharing breakfast highlighted the inequalities that Jordan and his team were working to address. As the distribution continued, more people arrived, some having walked considerable distances after hearing about the morning meals. Jordan made sure to pace the distribution, knowing from experience that people would continue to arrive for several hours. His attention to detail, once famous on the basketball court, now ensured that resources were managed effectively to help as many people as possible. The atmosphere remained calm and respectful, with people waiting patiently in line, often chatting quietly among themselves or with the volunteers. Some shared their stories of jobs lost, health problems, unfortunate circumstances that had led them to this point. Jordan listened when people wanted to talk, understanding that sometimes being heard is as important as being fed. Among the regulars was an elderly veteran named James, who had once been a high school basketball coach before a series of setbacks had left him homeless. He recognized Jordan immediately on that first morning months ago but had simply nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Now they shared a special handshake each morning, a small ritual that meant the world to James and reminded Jordan why he had started this quiet mission. The morning's rhythm continued undisturbed until a police cruiser pulled up slowly along the park's main drive. The officer inside watched the gathering with growing concern, his expression suggesting that he saw a problem rather than an act of community service. His arrival created a subtle tension in the air, felt first by those who had experienced previous interactions with law enforcement. Jordan noticed the police car but continued his work without pause. His presence had a calming effect on those around him, many of whom had tensed up at the sight of law enforcement. He had dealt with similar situations before, always managing to defuse them with the same grace he had shown on the basketball court. The officer continued to observe the scene, his hand resting casually on his car door as if deciding whether to intervene. The morning sun glinted off his badge and the polished hood of his cruiser, creating a sharp contrast with the simple folding tables and donated food containers being distributed nearby. The gathering crowd watched the police car with wary eyes, some beginning to step back or consider leaving. Years of experience had taught them that such attention rarely led to positive outcomes. But Jordan's continued calm presence encouraged them to stay, to trust that this morning's meal wouldn't be interrupted. Some of the volunteers exchanged knowing looks, having seen similar situations before. They continued their work with deliberate normality, following Jordan's lead in maintaining the dignity and purpose of their morning mission. The police car's presence was like a stone dropped in a calm pond, creating ripples of tension that threatened to disturb the peaceful scene. The officer finally opened his car door, stepping out with the deliberate movement of someone who had already decided there was a problem to address. His polished shoes crunched on the gravel path as he approached, his hand resting casually on his belt in that universal gesture of authority. He was young, probably new to the force, with the kind of confidence that sometimes comes from inexperience. Jordan continued passing out breakfast containers, his movements unhurried and precise. His hoodie was still up, his face partially shadowed, but his presence seemed to grow more commanding with each step the officer took toward the gathering. The morning sun caught the steam rising from coffee cups and the officer's polished badge, creating an almost theatrical lighting effect for what was about to unfold. The gathered crowd fell quieter, conversations dropping to whispers as the officer approached. Years of collective experience with authority had taught them to be cautious, to expect the worst. But something was different this morning. They had Jordan standing with them, his quiet dignity and strength providing a shield against whatever was about to happen. The tension in the air was palpable now, like the heaviness before a storm. The officer's approach had created a subtle shift in the atmosphere, changing what had been a peaceful morning of community service into something more complicated. But Jordan's calm presence remained unchanged, a steady anchor in the growing turbulence of the moment. The scene was set for a confrontation that would challenge assumptions about authority, compassion, and the true meaning of public service. The officer, the famous athlete, and the gathered community were about to become part of a story that would remind everyone present about the importance of seeing beyond surfaces and treating every human being with dignity and respect. The young officer's boots echoed against the park's paved pathway as he approached the gathering, his demeanor radiating the kind of authority that comes from a badge rather than experience. The morning sun glinted off his nameplate, Officer Reynolds, as he surveyed the scene before him with growing disapproval. His hand remained casually positioned near his belt, a subtle gesture of authority that didn't go unnoticed by the gathered crowd. Michael Jordan continued his work, his movements deliberate and purposeful as he handed out breakfast containers to those waiting in line. His years of experience in high-pressure situations had taught him the value of maintaining composure, and that same poise was evident now as he sensed the approaching confrontation. The hood of his black sweatshirt was still up, partially obscuring his famous face from the officer's immediate recognition. The morning had grown slightly warmer, but there was still a bite in the air that made the steam rising from coffee cups dance like spirits in the sunlight. The Chicago skyline provided a dramatic backdrop to the scene, its gleaming towers standing in stark contrast to the simple act of human kindness unfolding in their shadow. The gathered crowd had grown quieter, their conversations dropping to whispers as they watched the officer's approach. Among those present was Sarah, a former schoolteacher who had lost everything to medical bills. She clutched her coffee cup tighter, the warmth seeping into hands that had grown cold from another night spent outdoors. Like many others there, she had come to rely not just on the food, but on the dignity with which it was provided. Now she watched the approaching officer with the wariness of someone who had learned that authority doesn't always understand compassion. Officer Reynolds stopped a few feet from the tables, his posture rigid with disapproval. His eyes scanned the gathering, taking in the folding tables laden with food containers, the line of homeless individuals waiting patiently, and the volunteers working efficiently to distribute the morning meals. His gaze finally settled on the tall figure in the black hoodie who seemed to be coordinating the effort. The park had grown busier now, with more morning joggers and commuters passing by. Some slowed their pace to watch the scene unfold, sensing the tension building between the young officer and the food distribution team. The morning light caught the officer's badge as he shifted his stance, creating a brief flash that seemed to symbolize the imminent clash of authority and compassion. Jordan's volunteers continued their work, following his lead in maintaining calm and focus. They had developed a smooth system over the months, ensuring that everyone received not just food, but also a moment of human connection. The officer's presence threatened to disrupt this carefully cultivated atmosphere of dignity and respect. James, the former basketball coach, stood nearby, his military training evident in the way he assessed the situation. He had seen similar scenes play out before, but something felt different this time. Perhaps it was the quiet strength emanating from the tall man in the hoodie, or the way the gathered community seemed to draw courage from his presence. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, a sound that carried across the now quieter gathering. His voice, when it came, carried the artificial authority of someone trying to sound more confident than they felt. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded, his eyes still fixed on Jordan's partially hidden face. The question hung in the morning air like the steam from the coffee cups, waiting for a response that would change the dynamic of this encounter. Jordan turned slowly, his movements carrying the same grace that had made him famous on the basketball court. He faced the officer directly but continued to help those in line, his actions making it clear that the officer's presence wouldn't interrupt the important work being done. His hood remained up, but his presence seemed to grow more commanding with each passing moment. The gathered crowd watched with bated breath, many having experienced similar confrontations before, but never with someone like Jordan standing between them and authority. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the park's paths and illuminating the scene with greater clarity. The contrast between the officer's crisp uniform and Jordan's simple hoodie seemed to emphasize the different approaches to serving the community. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight, perhaps sensing that this situation wasn't as straightforward as he had initially assumed. His hand remained near his belt, but there was a slight uncertainty in his stance now, as if he was beginning to realize he might be misreading the situation. The morning light caught his young face, revealing features that suggested he was relatively new to the force. The line of people waiting for food had grown longer, not shorter, despite the officer's presence. Many were regulars who had come to trust in the consistency and dignity of these morning gatherings. They watched the unfolding scene with concern, but also with a quiet confidence in the tall man who had never failed them before. Jordan's volunteers maintained their positions, continuing to distribute food with the same efficiency and respect that characterized every morning. Their actions spoke of a commitment that went beyond charity. This was about recognizing the humanity in each person who approached their tables. The officer's presence had created tension, but it hadn't disrupted the essential purpose of their gathering. The Chicago skyline seemed to stand witness to the scene, its towers reaching into the morning sky like silent observers. The park had become a stage where two very different approaches to public service were about to clash, one rooted in authority and control, the other in compassion and understanding. Some of the passing commuters had stopped to watch now, forming a loose ring around the scene. Their presence added another layer to the unfolding drama, as if the wider community was being called to witness this moment of confrontation between authority and compassion. Phones were discreetly raised, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Jordan's height became more apparent as he stood at his full stance, his athletic frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. Though his hood still partially obscured his face, there was no hiding the natural authority that emanated from his presence. This was the same commanding presence that had led teams to championships, now focused on protecting this small community of souls who had gathered for breakfast. Officer Reynolds' voice carried a slight tremor when he spoke again, perhaps sensing that he had stepped into something more significant than a routine park disturbance. His youth became more apparent in the morning light, suggesting he might be the same age Jordan had been when he first joined the NBA. The parallel wasn't lost on those watching, one young man at the beginning of his career in public service, facing another who had redefined what service to community could mean. The gathered crowd had grown still, but not with the usual fear that accompanied police presence. Instead, there was an anticipation, a sense that they were about to witness something important. Jordan's calm presence seemed to provide a shield of dignity that extended to everyone present. The morning light continued to strengthen, illuminating the scene with greater clarity. Steam still rose from coffee cups, creating a kind of halo effect around the gathering. The contrast between the officer's polished appearance and the simple sincerity of the food distribution effort became more striking in the clear light. James, the veteran, had moved closer to the tables, his military bearing adding another layer of quiet authority to the scene. His presence seemed to remind everyone that service to community could take many forms, and that true authority often came from compassion rather than power. The officer's nameplate caught the light as he shifted his stance again, the name, Reynolds, gleaming briefly. He was beginning to realize that this situation wouldn't be resolved with the usual display of authority. Something about the tall man's presence demanded a different approach, though Officer Reynolds hadn't yet figured out what that might be. Jordan's movements remained unhurried as he continued to help those in line, his actions making it clear that the officer's presence wouldn't disrupt their morning mission. Each person who approached the table received the same respectful attention, the same quiet acknowledgement of their humanity, despite the growing tension in the air. Sarah, the former teacher, watched the scene unfold with growing hope. She had seen too many similar gatherings dispersed by authority, too many acts of kindness interrupted by those who didn't understand the deeper purpose behind them. But something was different this morning. The tall man's presence seemed to change the usual dynamic between the homeless and those who wished to move them along. The Chicago morning had fully bloomed now, the sun's warmth beginning to cut through the earlier chill. The park's paths were filled with more people, many of whom slowed their hurried pace to observe the standoff between the young officer and the mysterious tall man in the hoodie. The scene had taken on an almost theatrical quality, with the city itself providing the backdrop for this drama about authority, compassion, and understanding. The officer's confident approach had faltered slightly, replaced by a growing uncertainty about how to handle this situation. His training hadn't prepared him for this particular scenario, a well-organized food distribution effort led by someone whose very presence commanded respect, even with his face partially hidden by a hood. Jordan's volunteers worked with quiet efficiency, their actions demonstrating that this wasn't some haphazard gathering but a carefully organized effort to serve the community. The tables were well-stocked, the distribution system smooth and respectful, everything speaking to the thought and care that had gone into this morning ritual. The gathered crowd maintained their quiet dignity, drawing strength from Jordan's calm presence. Many had faced similar situations before, but never with someone of his stature standing between them and authority. The morning light caught the steam rising from coffee cups, creating an almost mystical atmosphere around the gathering. Officer Reynolds' young face showed the first signs of doubt, perhaps sensing that he was about to learn an important lesson about the true meaning of public service. His hand had dropped away from his belt, his posture becoming less confrontational as he began to realize that this situation required a different approach. Officer Reynolds drew himself up to his full height, though he still stood several inches shorter than the man in the hoodie. His voice carried a forced authority as he spoke. "This gathering doesn't have a permit. You can't just set up unauthorized food distribution in a public park." The words echoed across the suddenly quiet space, causing several people in line to step back instinctively. Michael Jordan turned fully to face the officer now, his movements carrying the same fluid grace that had made him a legend on the basketball court. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried its own authority, the kind earned through years of leadership both on and off the court. "We're not causing any problems here, officer. We're just making sure people don't go hungry." The young officer's face flushed slightly at the calm response, perhaps expecting more resistance. "That's not the point," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "There are proper channels for this kind of thing. You need permits, health department approvals. You can't just hand out food wherever you want." His hand had returned to his belt, a nervous gesture that betrayed his uncertainty. Jordan continued his work as he spoke, passing another breakfast container to an elderly woman who had been waiting patiently in line. "Sometimes proper channels don't move fast enough for hungry people, officer. Sometimes you have to do what's right now." The simple wisdom in his words carried across the gathering, causing several onlookers to nod in agreement. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight, increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Look, I'm going to need to see some ID and you're going to have to shut this down." His voice carried less conviction now, as if he was beginning to sense that he might be on the wrong side of this confrontation. The morning sun had risen higher, and as Jordan turned to face the officer again, the light caught his face as his hood fell back slightly. "Sure, I'll show you my ID," he said, reaching into his back pocket. "But first, let me ask you something. What do you think is more disruptive to this park? People getting a warm breakfast, or you trying to stop them from eating?" The officer's eyes widened as he caught a clearer glimpse of Jordan's face, recognition beginning to dawn. His hand dropped from his belt as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The gathered crowd watched in silence as the dynamic began to shift, the officer's authority diminishing in the face of Jordan's quiet dignity. You're Michael Jordan," Officer Reynolds stammered, his professional demeanor cracking as he realized who he had been confronting. The morning light seemed to illuminate Jordan's face more clearly now, leaving no doubt about his identity. The officer took an unconscious step backward, his earlier confidence evaporating. Jordan's response was measured, his voice carrying the same intensity he had once brought to crucial game moments. "Yes, I am. But that's not what's important here. What's important is that these people need breakfast, and we're here to provide it. Now, would you like to help us serve, or are you going to keep trying to stop us from feeding hungry people?" The gathered crowd had grown larger, with morning commuters and joggers stopping to witness the encounter. Phones were raised to capture the moment, but Jordan's focus remained on the officer, giving him space to make the right choice. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see how the young officer would respond. Officer Reynolds swallowed hard, his face flushing deeper as he realized the full implications of the situation. I'm just doing my job, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. His youth and inexperience were more apparent now, standing in stark contrast to Jordan's seasoned presence. Jordan's next words carried the weight of years of public service, both on and off the court. Your job is to serve and protect the community, right? Well, look around you. This is the community, all of it, not just the parts that are comfortable to look at. These people need protection too, and sometimes that protection means making sure they don't go hungry. The officer's gaze swept across the gathered crowd, seeing them perhaps for the first time as individuals rather than a problem to be solved. The morning light illuminated faces that told stories of hardship, dignity, and resilience. Jordan's words had forced him to confront his own preconceptions about law enforcement's role in the community. Sarah, the former teacher, stepped forward then, her voice quiet but clear. Officer, I used to teach middle school for 20 years. Now I sleep in this park. Life can change for any of us. What Mr. Jordan and these volunteers do here, it's not just about the food. It's about remembering that we're all human beings. Jordan nodded in appreciation of her words, then turned back to the officer. You have a choice to make here, Officer Reynolds. You can either be part of the problem or part of the solution. What's it going to be? The question hung in the morning air, weighted with significance beyond this single moment. The gathered crowd watched in respectful silence as the young officer struggled with his decision. His earlier certainty about procedure and authority had been replaced by a more complex understanding of his role in the community. Jordan's presence had forced him to confront the difference between enforcing rules and serving justice. James, the veteran, moved closer to the scene, his military bearing adding another layer of gravity to the moment. Son, he addressed the officer, I served this country for 20 years. Let me tell you something about service. It's not about following rules blindly. It's about understanding why the rules exist and knowing when compassion serves justice better than enforcement. Officer Reynolds stood straighter at the veteran's words, perhaps recognizing a different kind of authority in them. His hand had moved completely away from his belt now, his posture becoming less confrontational. The morning sun caught his badge again, but this time it seemed to remind everyone present of the true meaning of the motto, to serve and protect. Jordan continued his work as he spoke, his actions demonstrating that the mission of feeding the hungry wouldn't be interrupted. You know, officer, I've learned something in my years of playing basketball and being in the public eye. True leadership isn't about showing power over others, it's about empowering others to be their best selves. The officer's resistance had crumbled now, replaced by a growing understanding of the situation. His eyes moved from the orderly food distribution to the grateful recipients, seeing the dignity and respect with which the entire operation was conducted. The rules he had been so eager to enforce suddenly seemed less important than the human needs being met. A small child in line waved at the officer, offering an innocent smile that seemed to cut through the last of his official demeanor. The simple gesture served as a powerful reminder that behind every regulation and procedure were real human beings with real needs. Jordan noticed the interaction and smiled, recognizing another teaching moment. You know what makes this country great, officer? Jordan asked, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had represented America on the global stage. It's not our rules or our regulations. It's our capacity for compassion, our ability to see beyond surfaces and recognize the humanity in each other. The gathering had taken on an almost educational atmosphere now, with Jordan's quiet wisdom transforming what could have been a confrontation into a moment of community growth. The officer's youth seemed less of a liability and more of an opportunity, a chance to shape a new generation of law enforcement with a broader understanding of public service. Other volunteers had continued their work throughout the exchange, their steady dedication a testament to the importance of their mission. The line continued to move efficiently, each person receiving not just food but also the dignity of being seen and acknowledged as a valuable member of the community. Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, visibly wrestling with his next words. I didn't understand, he finally admitted, his voice carrying the humility of someone learning a valuable lesson. I was just thinking about the regulations, not about the people. The admission seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, allowing him to stand straighter despite his acknowledged mistake. Jordan's response was gracious, recognizing the courage it takes to admit error. Understanding is the first step to change, officer. Now, would you like to see what real community service looks like? He gestured to the busy distribution line, offering the young officer a chance at redemption through action rather than words. The morning had grown warmer, but it wasn't just the sun that had changed the atmosphere in the park. The tension of confrontation had been transformed into an opportunity for connection and understanding. The gathered crowd watched as the officer faced a moment of decision that would define not just this morning, but potentially his entire approach to his chosen profession. The Chicago skyline stood witness to this small but significant moment of transformation, its towers reaching into the blue morning sky like exclamation points punctuating the importance of what was unfolding below. The park had become more than just a setting, it was now a classroom where vital lessons about community, service, and human dignity were being taught. Officer Reynolds took a deep breath, then did something that surprised everyone present. He removed his jacket, carefully folded it, and placed it on the corner of the distribution table. "Where do you need me?" he asked, his voice carrying a new kind of authority, the kind that comes from choosing to serve rather than command. Michael Jordan's smile was warm and genuine as he handed the young officer a pair of serving gloves. "Welcome to the team, officer," he said, his words carrying echoes of countless locker room speeches, but this time in service of a different kind of victory. "Let's show you how we make a real difference in this community." The gathered crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful. Several people applauded, while others nodded in approval. The tension that had filled the air just moments before was replaced by something else, a sense of witnessing a moment of genuine transformation. The morning sun seemed to shine brighter, as if nature itself was acknowledging the power of choosing compassion over confrontation. Jordan guided the officer through the food distribution process, showing him the same patience and leadership that had once guided rookie players through their first games. "See, it's not just about handing out food," he explained as they worked. "It's about acknowledging each person, making eye contact, showing them the respect they deserve as human beings." Officer Reynolds proved to be a quick study, his natural instincts for public service finding a new channel of expression. His interactions with the people in line were tentative at first, but grew more confident as he began to see beyond labels and stereotypes to the individual stories and struggles of each person he served. Sarah, the former teacher, approached the table again, this time with a warm smile for the officer who had so recently threatened to shut down their morning gathering. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," she said softly as he handed her a fresh cup of coffee. "And even more courage to do something about it." The morning continued to unfold, but now with an added dimension of community building. Other police officers who passed by the park slowed their patrol cars, curious about the sight of their colleague working alongside the basketball legend to serve breakfast to the homeless. Some even parked and came over to investigate, leading to more conversations about the true meaning of protecting and serving the community. Jordan worked steadily, his presence a constant reminder of how success and fame could be channeled into meaningful service. His voice carried across the gathering as he shared stories with Officer Reynolds about his own journey to understanding the importance of giving back. "You know, winning championships is amazing," he said as they worked, "but nothing compares to the feeling of making a real difference in someone's life." The young officer listened intently, his earlier embarrassment transformed into genuine interest and engagement. His questions revealed a growing understanding of the complexity of homelessness and the importance of approaching community problems with compassion rather than just enforcement. "I never thought about it this way before," he admitted as he helped an elderly man with his breakfast. James, the veteran, had taken up a position near the officer, sharing his own insights about service and community. "You know what they taught us in the military?" he said as they worked. "The strongest unit is the one that takes care of its own. And these people, they're our own, whether we recognize it or not." The morning crowd had grown even larger now, but not just with people seeking breakfast. Word had spread through social media about Michael Jordan and the police officers serving breakfast together, attracting attention from local news outlets and curious onlookers. But Jordan maintained the dignity of the gathering, ensuring that the focus remained on serving those in need rather than creating a media spectacle. Officer Reynolds' transformation continued throughout the morning. His interactions with the homeless individuals became more natural, more human. He began to learn names, to hear stories, to understand the complex circumstances that had led people to seek breakfast in the park. Each interaction seemed to deepen his understanding of what it truly meant to serve and protect. Jordan's quiet leadership continued to guide the operation, his presence ensuring that the growing attention didn't distract from their primary mission. He shared insights with the officer about community building, about the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances, about the power of treating every person with dignity regardless of their circumstances. The morning light had grown stronger, illuminating the scene with crystal clarity. The Chicago skyline provided a dramatic backdrop to this lesson in community service, while the park's paths filled with more morning commuters, many of whom slowed their hurried pace to witness the unusual collaboration between the sports legend and the young police officer. Some of the regular volunteers shared their own perspectives with Officer Reynolds, helping him understand the importance of their morning ritual. They explained how consistent, respectful support could help people maintain their dignity while facing difficult circumstances. The officer listened with growing appreciation for the complexity of the issues he had earlier tried to solve with simple enforcement. Jordan's voice carried quiet authority as he continued to guide both the food distribution and the officer's education. "You see, officer," he said as they worked together, "sometimes the biggest impact we can have isn't through enforcing rules, but through showing people that someone cares. That's what builds real community safety." The transformation in Officer Reynolds was visible to everyone present. His earlier rigid posture had softened, his interactions had become more genuine, and his understanding of his role in the community had visibly evolved. The badge on his uniform seemed to shine differently now, representing not just authority but also compassion and service. As the morning progressed, other police officers who had stopped by began to engage in conversations about implementing similar approaches in their own patrols. Jordan's example had sparked discussions about how law enforcement could better serve the whole community, especially its most vulnerable members. The breakfast service was winding down now, but the impact of the morning's events was clearly just beginning. Officer Reynolds helped with the cleanup, his actions demonstrating his complete commitment to his new understanding of community service. His questions to Jordan and the other volunteers showed genuine interest in learning how to better serve his community. Sarah approached the officer one last time, extending her hand in friendship. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being willing to learn and change. It gives us hope." The officer's handshake was firm and sincere, his face showing the impact of her words and the morning's experiences. Jordan gathered everyone for a final word, his natural leadership drawing all eyes to him. "This is what community looks like," he said, gesturing to the diverse group of people who had come together that morning. "It's not about rules or regulations, it's about people taking care of people." Officer Reynolds stood straighter as Jordan continued, absorbing every word. The morning sun caught his badge again, but now it seemed to symbolize a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. His transformation from enforcement officer to community servant was complete. The impact of the morning's events had already begun to spread beyond the park. Social media was buzzing with images and stories of the basketball legend and the police officer serving breakfast together, but the real story was in the changed hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it firsthand. Jordan's final words to Officer Reynolds carried the weight of both his athletic achievements and his commitment to community service. "Remember this morning," he said, placing a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Remember that true authority comes from serving others, not from exercising power over them." The officer nodded, his face showing the impact of the lesson he had learned. "I won't forget," he promised, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone who had experienced a genuine change of heart. "Thank you for showing me what real public service looks like." As the morning's gathering dispersed, the impact of what had transpired continued to resonate through the park and beyond. The simple act of serving breakfast had become a powerful lesson in community, compassion, and the true meaning of public service. The Chicago morning had warmed considerably, but it wasn't just the temperature that had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in Grant Park that day. A new understanding of community service had been born, bridging the gap between authority and compassion. Jordan's quiet example had shown everyone present that true greatness isn't just about athletic achievement or official position, it's about how we treat those in need, how we respond to being wrong, and how we choose to use whatever influence we have to make our community better. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and share your own stories about moments when someone's compassion changed your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories that remind us about the power of kindness and understanding. Remember, sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on the basketball court or through enforcing rules. They're won in the everyday moments when we choose to serve others with dignity and respect.